Sam Seder, Emma Vigeland on the Majority Report. It is a pleasure to welcome back to the program Elie Mystal. He is the justice correspondent at The Nation. And if you want to know more about this case we're going to be discussing, I cannot recommend his play-by-play of the Supreme Court oral arguments about this on Twitter. It was an incredibly entertaining and disturbing and entertaining read. Elie, welcome back to the program.
Thank you so much. Nice to see you, Sam. Nice to see you, Emma. Yeah, that was nice, a 3.5-hour argument. And honestly, by the end, like, I was trying to wipe the blood away from my ears. It was so infuriating, but I was trying. It's an important case. I argue that it is the most important case about democracy that the court is hearing this term. And I say that knowing full well that they have to decide whether the orange criminal man can run again and if he's immune from everything, including SEAL team. Like, I understand that we have big Trump cases up, but in terms of like how our country functions, this is the biggest case this term. This is the biggest case in 10 years. And it's going to function poorly. Yeah,
I hope that most people in our audience, when we say the Chevron deference doctrine, know what it is, because I've tried to be relentless about this, because it really has been something that has been coming since really Donald Trump's election and the potential for conservatives to take over. And you do a great job in walking through the history of this, because it's there's a sort of an interesting irony about how this came about, because it's contrary to maybe sort of the political or the sort of like the policy decisions that those of us on the left would have wanted brought this about. But it's also, I think, important to put into context when this happened and how much Chevron has shaped really the modern U.S. administrative state in some ways.
Look, Republicans used to love Chevron deference. It was their idea. Okay, so let's go all the way back to 1984. Ronald Reagan in charge, fire and air traffic control people, just saying no to regulation, right? And so he puts in a bunch of people in the executive agencies. We call it the administrative state now, but into the cabinet level positions. He puts in a lot of people who don't want those institutions to succeed. They want them to fail. Right. And one of those people is a woman named Anne M. Gorsuch. Yes. Mother of current Supreme Court Justice Neil Gorsuch. Reagan puts her into the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, with the remit to basically destroy it from the inside out. Right. So one of the things she does is that she changes a rule. The Clean Air Act said that in order to pollute the air, you had to get a permit and whatever. And Anne Gorsuch said, yeah, we're not going to do that. We're going to have this special rule so that some people can pollute the air without needing a permit, right? So she gets sued. She gets sued as the head of the EPA by environmental groups, saying that she is applying the Clean Air Act incorrectly, right, against the will of Congress. This goes up to the Supreme Court, and in a unanimous decision, I'll say that again, a unanimous Supreme Court decision, it says, no. The experts at the executive agencies are the people who are allowed to interpret the rules of Congress, right? And that, unfortunately for me as a liberal and an environmentalist in 1984, although in 1984 I was like, 6? Unfortunately for the future, that makes sense. Because, of course, when Congress passes a law, there are going to be gaps. There's going to be ambiguity. Congress, if y'all have been paying attention, ain't always on the ball, right? They don't always know exactly what they're doing, right? So we're going to have interpretation. And what the Chevron case was in 1984, it said that the executive agencies get to make these close calls as opposed to judges. And so for a long time, conservatives loved it. Why, Sam? Because they were sure that they had a better chance of keeping control of the White House and the executive agencies, Reagan, Bush 2, right? as opposed to taking control of the Supreme Court, which from the perspective of 1984 was kind of a liberally captured institution. You fast forward 40 years, and that's why Republicans have changed. That's why they've flip-flopped. They now understand that it's easier for them to take anti-democratic control over the Supreme Court than it is to win presidential elections with orange crazy people.
And we should say there's a couple of things too that I want to point out here. I mean, Congress's sort of like hijinks aside, it really is a hard thing for a body of 435 people to come up with the answer as to like how much mercury in the air, if it is fired at a certain temperature, is unhealthy for people to inhale. Like, these are questions that are best left to the experts.
I mean, think about it. I like to go through the environmental issue because I think it's the most pressing one in our country, right? But like, think about the FAA, right? Like, how is Congress the right people to decide exactly how many nuts and bolts have to be on the plane before it can fly? No, that's the Federal Aeronautics Aviation Administration that needs to be making that decision. Think about the SEC, right? We can make all the banking laws that we want, but at some point, it's an SEC expert that has to figure out how to apply those banking laws to a banking industry that's always going to be trying to find their different ways around them, right? Think about the FDA, right? Think about the FDA having just come out of the COVID pandemic. Like, who is best placed to decide what drugs and medications and vaccines are available for market? Do we want Congress to decide? Do we really think that like Ted Cruz is the person that needs to be deciding what vaccines were allowed, or do we want experts at the FDA to do it? That's why, for the most part, liberals this entire time, even when Chevron deference's case go against us, for the most part, liberals support this idea of letting experts decide, of letting facts decide, as opposed to judges.
Well, I'm also less concerned about, I mean, look, Ted Cruz decides at one point or another, there is going to be a political influence on these agencies to some degree, right? I mean, because, that's what the original Chevron case was about. And it really seems to me to be a question of, do we want judges making these assessments over, the body politic as filtered through experts? But here's the other thing that I think is like sort of also hard to sort of like see on its face is that in 1984, we're 12 years out from 14 years out. I mean, this case starts actually before than 84. It's resolved in 84. We're only 12 years out or so from the actual existence of the EPA. Like the 60s and the 70s was really the growth of the administrative state in the way that we know it now, the regulatory state where things were modernized. And there was not the same sort of like capacity for legal challenge on these things that we see growing into the 80s, into the 90s. I mean, I went to, I was a little older than in 1984, sadly to say. But when I went to law school in 1990, there was something like 40,000 lawyers graduating a year, as opposed to like when my father went to law school in the early 60s, where there's 10,000 graduating a year. Now, the U.S. population had not grown by 4 times in that point, but their corporations in the 70s began their assault on the regulatory state. And it started to culminate at this time. And the Chevron Doctrine became hugely important as a mechanism to allow our administrative state to just function, because Congress can't go back every time that there's a new thing and address it with the speed that a lot of these agencies can.
And frankly, neither can the courts. I mean, this actually came up during oral arguments where Elizabeth Prelogar, the Solicitor General of the United States, defending Chevron deference, talked openly about how simply impractical it was to take this away and expect judges and state court judges, federal judges, and all of these different jurisdictions to make up these rules as they go along. She said that in addition to being impractical, it would also create various conflicting rulings at all levels of our system. Ketanji Brown Jackson said that it would be impractical and chaotic to take this away because, as you point out, Sam, we are a litigious people, right? We are a nacho-eating, football-loving, litigious people. And what's going to happen without Chevron deference is that every time you see a regulation that you don't like, instead of dealing with the experts, you run to court and you try to get a favorable judge to basically overturn the executive decision and start an entire legal battle. Another thing that came up during the case was that since 1984, there have been over 17,000 cases decided under the Chevron deference rule. If you take it out, you potentially not only open yourself up to all this new litigation going forward, you also potentially open yourself up to relitigating those 17,000 cases, because in each one of those cases, somebody lost, right? Usually a corporation, usually somebody who doesn't like regulation, somebody lost, and they will have an opportunity potentially to relitigate that and sue. So you're talking about an entirely chaotic system, but you're also talking about the system that Republicans want, the system that conservatives want. And we can't talk about this without understanding why Republicans and conservatives and people like Neil Gorsuch would do this when it's so obviously impractical and, as Jackson said, chaotic. And the reason is because in a kind of chaotic, impractical, ridiculous system, there is no regulation, right?
Exactly.
Because when you can't enforce a regulation from Congress, when you don't have the executive agencies able to make those decisions, what you end up with is a de facto deregulatory system, because the system cannot handle the influx of litigation and conflict and lawsuits.
Well, what do you say to, and I know the answer to this, but there are going to be people that say, well, when the Republican wins the presidency, when Trump wins, he stacks the administrative state with a bunch of cronies and a bunch of horrible people. Scott, what was his last name for the EPA? The guy that Pruitt. Scott Pruitt, who worked his whole career to dismantle and sue the EPA, becomes the head of it. Some people may say, well, hey, it could be kind of a wash. We know that that's not the case based on what you lay out. But what's the counter argument to that claim made by people?
Democracy, baby. Yeah. I mean, that's what the presidents being able to change executive policy is part of the reason why we have a democracy. Again, Emma, your point came up during oral arguments where Brett Kavanaugh essentially made your point, the point that you're surfacing, right? They're like, every 4 or 8 years, the law changes wildly. That's not good. And again, it fell to Justice Jackson to be like, that's democracy, Brett. That's what happens. And that's why I say this is one of the most important cases about democracy over this century, right? Because it is critical that I, as a voter, have an opportunity to change some of these laws, to change some of these executive rulings that perhaps I don't like, right? I want to be able to vote for a president who might be able to change how the SEC operates, right? Who might be able to change the DOJ antitrust division to actually do, right? I want to be able to vote for that. And if you take the power away from the executive agencies, you're not giving it to Congress. This is the point that's critical, right? You're not giving the power back to Congress because, as we've discussed, Congress is not going to make all of these rules. You're giving the power to judges who I don't get to vote for. Right?
I think that's also, I think that's exactly the point. And it's not just a question. I mean, obviously it's one of democracy, but it's also one of capacity, because under the non-Chevron deference regime, the agency doesn't have, there's one group of people who want the agency to do nothing, and there's another group of people who want the agency to do things.
Right.
Like the Environmental Protection Agency. And they want them to proactively and actively do things. It diminishes the capacity of these agencies to do things and only allows them to not do things, essentially, right? I mean, that's ultimately the point. We had suits against Scott Pruitt where the EPA was not doing what it was supposed to do. Some of those suits won, some of those suits lost. But the agency will be inhibited from what it can do on those years where there is an administration that wants them to do those things. And you can always even slow down. And in the opposite, like evening it out, Scott Pruitt go in there and just have all the people. Well, I mean, they did this with I think it was the Bureau of Land Use. They just said, okay, we're going to disperse everybody around the country and you're not going to work together anymore. There's a lot of different ways to destroy an agency, but really only one to make it work. And that is to give it the ability to act.
This is the asymmetrical war that I, as a liberal, progressive, crazy person, am always fighting, right? Because I want government to work. And to make government work, it's like a very complicated Lego, construction. You're trying to build a thing in the Millennium Falcon, and Republicans don't want government to work. So all they have to do is smash it, right? You can spend years building your Lego Millennium Falcon. Republican walks by, knocks it off the counter, breaks it into pieces, and says, mission accomplished, and then walks away. And that is what this case is at heart. The Republicans don't need government to work, don't want executive agencies to function. So if they smash them and break them and make them unable to function, that's as good as a win. That is the win. That is the end goal. And it's the asymmetricness of the war. You're trying to, it takes so little effort to break something. It takes so much more effort to make it work. And that's part of the grease on the wheels. Part of making it work is what they're trying to take away in this case.
Based upon what you heard in the oral arguments, what will be the principled reasons why, if the six decide to overturn the Chevron deference doctrine, what will be what will their argument be? And I imagine it won't be necessarily cohesive amongst the six, but they'll all have their own flavor.
Yeah, so there were two kind of competing arguments going. There was the what I call the nihilist wing, Thomas, Alito, Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, who are they're just done with it. They think it's a separation of powers issue, that the executive has taken power away from Congress, and they want to, quote, give it back to Congress. This is that core conservative lie that they are giving power back to Congress as opposed to the reality of taking power for the judiciary itself. So that's the four of them. Roberts and Barrett, who going into the argument, I had some hope would at least uphold precedent, because, we haven't even talked about this, Sam and Emma, but it's a 40-year-old case. Normally, precedent is supposed to be a thing in the Supreme Court, right? So they
already knocked out a 50-year-old individual right. They could do a 40-year-old doctrine. Are you kidding?
Who cares about that, right? So I had actually hoped that Roberts and Barrett would be more about defending precedent. They were not. But they seem to be arguing that getting rid of Chevron is not a big deal. The reason why I know that there have been 17,000 cases decided on Chevron is because Prelogar the Solicitor General had to say that to John Roberts when he was like, we don't really use Chevron deference anymore anyway. It's not really a big idea. So I think what Roberts and Barrett will say is that Chevron is not overturned. It's just been misinterpreted. And they're going to go back to an earlier interpretation called Skidmore about the administrative state that allows the court to basically intervene whenever it feels like it, whenever it feels the executive agencies have gotten it wrong. So I think that's how they're going to try to soft sell it. And then it'll be a competition to see whether or not Gorsuch writes an opinion that destroys Chevron completely that can get Barrett and Roberts. Or if he can't, then Roberts and Barrett will write something a little bit more mealy-mouthed to kind of have the same effect, but not with the same level of stridentness that Gorsuch would go with.
Are they going to use the major questions doctrine, which I should say, just for people who don't know, it existed, but in a very different fashion since 2000, not that long ago, and has only in the past couple of years, really since the Biden administration, become something that the court basically says, here's my get out of free jail card, whatever it is. This is my special wild card, and we're just going to put it down here.
Yeah, that didn't come up a lot. If Gorsuch gets to write this opinion, people need to understand that, I brought up his mom. Gorsuch has been on a crusade against Chevron deference for his entire career. It is why he is on the Supreme Court. It is the thing that made him famous amongst Republicans, his strident opposition to Chevron deference against the will of his predecessor, Antonin Scalia, who, like I said, Republicans used to love Chevron deference, right? So if Gorsuch writes the opinion, like it's going to be major, it could be very, very extreme. I don't know if he has a majority for the most extreme version of his opinion. So I don't think they're going to get to major questions doctrine. I think they're just going to do it on separation of powers with Roberts saying like, actually, and it's not a big deal.
Well, where's Alito in this then, too? I mean, I know that was in your piece a little bit about how he has changed his opinion on the issue, basically kind of going from where you talk about Scalia was to probably more in the Gorsuch camp now.
Yeah, Alito is down the clown with Gorsuch and Kavanaugh. He, in his oral arguments, he said, and I'm quoting, that Chevron deference was necessary in the past because judges used policy preferences to make decisions. But we don't do that anymore.
Oh, that's right. What just happened? What just happened last year? Yes.
Hey, abortion rights killed affirmative action, kills voting rights, all based on his personal political grievances. But apparently, Sam Alito, who spends, I swear to God, every night watching Fox News, can't consider his personal policy preferences when he makes decisions anymore. It was, again, blood spurting out of ears. Like it was a ridiculous statement. But he is, to answer your question, Emma, he is absolutely down the clown with the other nihilists because they don't want it to work. They don't actually want government to work, and they understand that this is the easiest way to make government not work and give themselves more power. I wrote in The Nation that the oral argument writ large was less like an argument and more like a coronation, with the court literally laughing with conservative super lawyer Paul Clement about how much power they were giving to themselves. It's they are crowning themselves kings and queens of the rest of the country.
And we should also say that, like, the sort of knock-on impact of this is that if you are a corporate lawyer, a corporate litigator, this is like, I want to say like a job security act, but this is like you can be now, like, if this gig happens, they're all going to be going like, I think I'm just about to get myself a slightly bigger boat. Like, I mean, the business, from a business standpoint, this isn't just about judges saying I'm empowering myself. This is about like sort of the fundamental building block of the Federalist Society. This is their Jobs Act. I mean, this is their push me into the next tax bracket act because it's off to the races on
tax
anything.
Bracket? Where we're going, we don't need no tax bracket. I mean, like,
that's a good point. That's a good point.
Right? I mean, look, Harlan Crow ain't paying these people for nothing. Right? Like, the Republicans who buy Supreme Court justices are getting something for their money, and this is what they're getting. This is also why, just to go back to an earlier point, this is why when people say like, oh, well, they don't have business before the court. No. Wealthy Republican donors always have business before the court. They don't have to have their name on the case. And this is a classic example of that because this helps their business in so many ways that it's worth it for however much they paid for Clarence Thomas's RV to get him on board for a thing like this, right? Like it's the only break I will pump on this statement, Sam, is that there might be a level of be careful what you wish for, right? Republicans want this now. Corporate entities want this now when they don't know what the law is, right? When you're Pfizer, right, and you're trying to put a new drug on the market, and you don't know what the FDA is going to do because you don't know what crazy Christian Judge Kaczmarek in Texas is going to do. You don't know what Eileen Cannon's going to do, so you don't know if your drug is going to be legal. Maybe then you'll have some regrets about killing Chevron deference. But that is down the line. That is a down the line problem. The today solution is to get rid of it and make all the money and stick it in their ears.
Right. I mean, that's a business complication. At the end of the day, though, everybody else loses in both scenarios. Yes. Right. Like, I mean, just because Pfizer doesn't have the opportunity to maximize their profit on a drug that may save people's lives, I mean, everybody loses in that situation in terms of that drug that could have been meaningful. But I'll tell you something, like whatever Coke Industries, if this thing, I'm convinced that you will be able to look at the stock market and pick out those industries that are just going to go straight to the moon the day after this ruling, or maybe, depending on how late in the day it comes. But let me ask you this. KBJ, in many of the cases, in many of these landmark cases, has been, in my mind, the voice of how this gets fixed in the future. And how far down that future becomes, I don't know. God willing, I'm still alive to see it. But honestly, like this, it begins the 20 or 30 year journey to return to an administrative state, assuming that there's anything left at that point. What did I know she raised the issue of like, you're going to open up 17,000 cases. And people should understand too, each one of those cases represents tens, hundreds of more instances where those cases sort of guided the way that the agencies operated and the way that industry operated. I mean, maybe thousands. I mean, who knows how many decisions are made as a function of those cases. But did you get a sense of like, what would be the arguments 10, 20, 30 years from now, unless we get lucky and there's a major accident, on the Beltway or whatever it is, when this will be returned to some type of sanity in the event that it gets overturned?
Well, Justice Jackson and Neil Gorsuch kind of previewed their next battle. And I say next, hopefully, because this requires, Democrats in Congress taking power and doing something with that power if they get it, which is, a big wish casting on my part. But Jackson pointed out that this could be fixed with legislation, right? That Chevron deference exists as a judge-made rule, so it's easy for judges to overturn that rule when they don't care about precedent anymore. But today, Congress could go out and legislate Chevron deference into our statutes, right? Pass a bill that says when ambiguity arises with acts of this body, we leave it to the executive agencies to resolve that ambiguity. It's a 3-sentence bill that can be passed today and signed by the president, and that would fix it. Except when she brought that up, Neil Gorsuch was basically like, I'm not sure that would be constitutional. That's where you get to the major question, Sam. So I don't think it's going to happen in this case, but if in the future Congress passes such a bill, what Neil Gorsuch will come back with then is basically saying that Congress doesn't have the right to delegate that authority.
That's the non-delegation doctrine, right? Right.
That is the future fight only if Democrats actually do something, right? I've made the same point with the abortion issue, right? That Democrats should legislate Roe v. Wade, at which point the Republicans will say, no, you can't have a nationwide right to an abortion because it violates the Commerce Clause. And then we have that battle, but you can't even get to that battle until Democrats Congress acts. And right now they don't have the power to act. If they do have the power in the future, that should be HR 1 at this point, reinstituting Chevron deference, but getting Democrats to win and then do something, and that's always difficult.
And so, and just to follow through on this, so that we're circling the square. What if in our dream scenario, Hakeem Jeffries, Speaker of the House, and I don't know. I guess Chuck Schumer, Senate Majority Leader,
Chuck Schumer's not our problem.
Says, they bring up their first bill of the year in 2025 after a landslide 60 Senate victory. We're going to pass this essentially a statutory version of the Chevron deference doctrine. That's when we hear the Supreme Court say, we're returning to a non-delegation doctrine, and this is the new Lochner era. We're finally here, essentially. Is that?
Yeah.
And that's basically what we're talking about.
You've played the future out very, very accurately. But yes, I think that's ultimately what happens. But again, we have a 6-3 court, right? And you only have the 4 nihilists. And the Supreme Court watchers, we call them the horsemen, right? Alito, Thomas, Gorsuch, and Kavanaugh are crazy people. Roberts and Barrett are just Republicans, right? And so, and I'm not saying that makes them necessarily better, but I'm saying that on some of these completely reimagining the country issues, like non-delegation doctrine, like major questions doctrine, I don't know that Roberts and Barrett have an opinion. At least they haven't put their flag in the nihilist camp quite as much. So you can imagine, at least, you could wish cast at least a version of events where Hakeem Jeffries passes it and Chuck Schumer passes it and Joe Biden signs it and Leonard Leo sues and he loses 5-4 as opposed to winning 6-3.
And so, if I hear you correctly, we are a one tragedy on a high-end fishing trip away from perhaps having a version of things. I'm not going to make you sign off on that.
Thank you. I like being employed.
Yeah, there you go. Yeah, that's. I think that. Well, here's the last question. And this is, I imagine this is a source of this is going to be a source of frustration for you until you decide that you cannot take any more of this profession. But this is something, like you say, will affect Americans if it happens on a daily basis. When they go buy food for their kids, when they go to the workplace and hope that something's not going to kill them, when they drink their water, when they breathe their air. I mean, this is going to impact every aspect of our lives. And do you think that 95% of Americans will not be aware of this, or 99.3% of Americans will not be aware of the implications of this case?
I mean, I'm pretty loud, so I gotta hope that only 99% of people cannot hear me, right? I've got to at least hope that. No, it is obviously frustrating to me when you read reports about what people on the ground, real Americans in diners, are thinking about with this election, and they're just they're not locking in on the real issues that we can fix. There are a bunch of issues that we can't fix, and I'm crying for those issues, right? But this is an issue that we can fix if we have Democrats in power, and you can't get people to kind of focus in on that. For me, the real frustration is with young people, right? Where the things that they're talking about, it's like, well, name me an issue that you care about, right? Do you care about the environment? Do you care about gun regulations, the Bureau of Alcohol and Tobacco and Firearms? Do you care? If you care about any of these things, then you should care about having a functioning government to be able to solve it, which means you're supposed to care about this case. But it's hard to get people to lock in, and that's why I'm so loud.
Well, I appreciate it. I mean, I think it's not just even people in diners. I mean, in terms of it's not just sort of like your average voter. Like even your most passionate, I think, advocates for these things do not see the direct correlation between what happens with these courts and what they hope to achieve.
It's why the courts are such the right thing to steal, right? If you're trying to figure out how to ruin a democracy, it's why the courts are the best thing to steal first, because people don't understand what they do. And it's not sexy, and it's not, they're not even on television, right? Like you can't chew popcorn to a Supreme Court argument, right? And so their power is so awesome, yet so underneath, right? So under the radar. And it becomes this kind of cesspool where they are able to, and I mean that kind of non-pejoratively, where they are able to take control of the structures of democracy and then leave only the appearance of democracy for people on voting day.
harrowing way to end this. Elie Mystal, and I will say that, like, following your Twitter feed during that argument was the next best thing, is to, like, being able to watch it live. Though it just occurred to me, like, the idea of you doing play-by-play on something like that would be amazing. Elie Mystal, Justice Correspondent at The Nation. We'll link to all of your pieces and to that Twitter thread at majority.fm and in the YouTube and podcast descriptions. Thanks so much.
Thanks,
really appreciate it.
Thanks, Sam. That's Emma. Nice seeing you.
Nice seeing you.